Environmental issues that span the entire Seaway and beyond have emerged in its first half-century of existence that have demanded attention. In 2004, a report entitled Great Lakes Shipping and Aquatic Invasive Species was put out in response to proposals to close the Seaway. Estimates placed the number of invasive species at 180, with lamprey eels, along with zebra and quagga mussels leading the way. While it ultimately did not recommend closure, it did highlight the billions of dollars in costs to remove these invaders from piping and power generation plants, public and private drinking water plants, and industrial facilities, as well as from lock and dam structures and marinas. Half to a third of all AIS introductions are attributed to ships' ballast water exchanges. It has become clear that several of these invasive species have been transplanted from the Baltic, Black, and North Seas.
Probably the purple loosestrife, maybe that's how they found their way to this part of the country. Those lampreys that they found in the Champlain, Lake Champlain, lampreys that weren't native to this area. Say if you try to develop an area close to the water, what you're going to do is you disturb that area and you make almost like a window of opportunity for other species to take hold there. The environment changes, then the fish will change, the microorganisms will change. So a lot of things go on that we don't see with the naked eye. There's even gar, a fish I never heard of all my life. And I don't know if that species came here only later on. About 10 years ago we were in the boat and this fellow had caught about 5 gar. I said, what is it? Looked like a swordfish. Big long snout like that.
I remember going down at Hooks Point there. Hooks Point, what did we do? Every spring, we went bullhead fishing. Every spring. It was a rite of passage for many kids. Go bullhead fishing. Well, today, regardless of the mud flats that are there, you wouldn't touch a bullhead out of here now. There's no way. It's become so inundated with really toxic filth, bottom line, that that sediment now is there. Now, how do you remove all that sediment without creating a bigger problem? Well, you're starting to talk some fairly significant changes to the riverbed itself or the waterbed itself, and you're also talking very, very big dollars.
And the reason I think we have problems with the water flow today is that we were told that they built a road from the South Shore to one of the islands in order for the construction trucks to be able to bring all the rocks, all that material, maybe thousands of tons of material, to help shore up all this island and this shoreline in order to hold the water for the ships to eventually pass by. And when they left and took the road out, we don't think that they took the whole thing out. And that might have been the beginning of when the sediment start gathering in this bay area. And now it seems like the water is this deep. But when we were kids, well, of course we were younger too, we would go out of bed and it seemed like it would be over our head, but it would never be in mud. If we did sectorial dredging, it would take years, but through those years, I think if we started upstream and opened it up a bit more, maybe it might even remedy itself, because there's not enough of a water flow. That's the problem. And because the shore seems to be coming up with the sediment, we might even lose this bay if we don't do something about it. The scientists that we worked with on the study said that if it keeps filling up with sediment at the rate it's been filling up, we might lose the whole area.
If this thing chokes out now and there's nothing here, not only would we have been disassociated from the river in my parents' generation, but now in my generation, we're being even disassociated from what we had as growing up as a kid as a direct result of, unfortunately, the Seaway going through. If the Seaway hadn't gone through, this waterway would be flowing. It'd be full of life. Very, very different thing. Very, very different thing.
Well, the planning process is probably going to be the longest process, because before we would touch it, we would make sure there'd be a feasibility study, an environmental impact assessment. Would it do more harm than good? We don't know that for sure. So before we'd want to undertake anything, we'd have to have a good look at what the impacts might be.
The Flat Rocks area and all the area between the Seaway and the river on the other side, eastern part of the community, I think is nice to be left just for a natural environment.
Well, if you talk to older people, they just like to have access. I was approached by an elder about 4 years ago to say, please work on trying to get me back to the other side. Another person who was affected, similar to my grandmother, who has now passed on, but is still here, and in her words, would like to see it there again, within her lifetime, to see her grandchildren, her great-grandchildren able to have access to the river, not the Seaway.
But you can still see there's roads and the flat rocks, and you can kind of see how it must have been at the time, or how it must have looked to have it, just be able to walk out. That's what people used to talk about, just being able to walk out your door and it was there. But and now it's radically different, yeah.
I'm not sure if the community is now looking for another pool, but to have access there and to have something similar to what Côte St. Catherine has in terms of a beach or at least a waterfront, a riverfront that Kahnawake could use, because there are other small bays and so on, and environmental impact would need to be done to take a look at what we would have to do, because we have, according to biologists and Fisheries and Oceans Canada, the largest freshwater sturgeon spawning area anywhere that they know of, right here on our North Shore as well. So all of those things need to be taken into consideration if we're to look at accessing it again.
The development of the hydro lines, roads, railways, and bridges slowly chipped away at Kahnawake lands and crept into Kahnawake consciousness over a long period of time. But it was the speed of the expropriations and construction of the Seaway that stunned the community, leaving people bewildered, angry, and divided that something like this could happen. The people decidedly took a collective stand against losing another inch for the benefit of the outside. Since then, the community has resisted any further incursions that cut into the territory, the culture, and the spirit.
Kahnawake is a very unique territory. It's a large territory. However, it's been cut up by so many land takings. How did Kahnawake go from having this large land base to this much smaller land base? Once we looked at that, we realized that the small land base that you have today has been further broken up, like the St. Lawrence Seaway expropriation, which is probably the most recent erosion of your territory, and the earlier things, the hydro lines, the railways and roads.
It's kind of interesting how all the railroads seem to hit every reserve on the way across Canada, because then you don't have to compensate as much or at all if you go through a reserve. So it's kind of interesting that when these large water projects, dams, seaways, things like that, always tended to be around or affect Native people more so than the rest of the general population.
But they always have a way of dividing us again. As I see today, I get angry. Because Kahnawake, we're in a box. You look at it. We can't go across the water, we got to fall in here. And all around now, this is getting, to me, it's sad.
I think they went through a whole bunch of different processes looking where the Seaway was going to go, and they picked the route that it took because it was going to disturb the least people, or in their estimation. It wasn't as densely populated, and you've got this big reserve in the middle, and who cares about that? So I guess once the route was mapped out, then it was just a series of legal processes. They passed the Seaway Expropriation Act, which enables Canada to legally expropriate lands. Like once an Expropriation Act is passed, then that gives the Crown the ability to expropriate whatever lands they want or need, provided they provide adequate compensation. And then that becomes another question as well, is what constitutes adequate compensation.
The land for the Seaway was expropriated through 3 orders in council that allowed the St. Lawrence Seaway Authority to take Kahnawake land through one section of the Indian Act, Section 35. And there was about 1,300 acres in total taken in by three different orders. There's also an issue of how the waterfront was changed, the loss of beaches, the loss of recreational areas, people who lost their homes and their home wasn't relocated the way they had wished.
The thing that I don't agree upon is to be forced to do something that you don't want to do. Very few people wanted this. they had no choice. It took us a long time to get used to because it was very ugly. Rock piles everywhere. It wasn't beautiful to see when it first opened.
The company Archer Daniels Midland approached the community to say, we'd like to put a grain elevator there. And people said, happened with the Seaway, it's not happening again. We're not having this kind of encroachment. We're not having people come into our community, use the land for something we don't know what it's going to be used for, leaving it dirty, leaving it used, and then taking off later, because that's the perception, I think correct perception of the Seaway. It was an encroachment. It is a denigration of the land. It's a denigration of it reduced our resources and our land base. And people decided that was it. That was the symbol. I mean, you can't avoid it. That's one of the things I thought was really interesting about the Seaway, is that no matter what age a person is, they can point to the Seaway. They can tell you exactly how it came about, what happened, what were the consequences, because they've heard their parents talk about, their grandparents talk about it, and the visible symbol is right there. It's not the same as with these kind of smaller, more gradual land expropriations, but the Seaway, you can't forget, it's there. It's an everlasting symbol of what happened.
They said it's surrendered land. I don't think it's surrendered land. I think it's forced. When you're beaten to a pulp, I guess you got to surrender sooner or later, and that's what happened with that. There's quite a land there that's still there. That I believe that for me myself, I always liked it as a boy to get it back. It belongs to Kahnawake, and it's way over there.
One example of a failed expropriation attempt was for land drawn up to be taken for a large traffic circle. Today, many community members are familiar with the Bridge to Nowhere south of the OCR. Less than 10 years after the Seaway removed the riverfront from Kahnawake, plans were developed to link the South Shore communities of Chattagee with a large 4-lane road to run along the western border of the territory to link up to a second bridge to Lachine and connect to Highway 13.
What happened is that the government started approaching us to widen the actual approach to the Mercier Bridge. So we started making inquiries what their intention was, why they wanted to widen that, and then we discovered that their intention was to build this new highway and this new big traffic circle in our community, on our land, and then make a new bridge from there right up to Lachine. They tried to convince us that this was good for us and that they would give us a lot of things. But for instance, in their ignorance, they offered to make us a little Indian village with teepees and all that type of stuff. That was, for example, that's the way they were thinking of how they would be doing something for us. But they were so convinced that they were going to go through with it that they started expropriating the land here, and they started building these bridges and the highways and everything. We stopped it, and we told them to get off our land. The people in Chattagee were putting pressure on us to have this highway. But when we refused, the government went to them to approach them to expropriate land so that they wouldn't move the whole circle on their land and the bridge from here, and they turned it down, So it was something that, they had to eat what they were throwing at us. So we said, there you go, you don't even want it on your land and you want to put it on our land. You think we're going to do it? And they didn't do it. They didn't have the opportunity to trick us as they did with, the Seaway before, because we had learned from that experience.
The Seaway will likely never be forgotten in the minds of future generations. But the hydro lines, bridges, and railways, they all have been normalized on our landscape for generations now, although they continue to serve an important purpose for Quebec. How do they contribute to the sense of loss brought on by the Seaway?
So a lot of these expropriations happened as a direct result of a national purpose. And that was pretty key in how the government at the time dealt with third parties, whether they be the CP Rails or the hydro people at the time, or you name it. And so they used that phrase in which to directly impact and get lands in Kahnawake. Now, it directly impacted a lot of people. I mean, people were displaced from their homes, lands were taken, areas were flooded. From that perspective, yet there was a huge impact and a direct impact at a community level or at the private person level in terms of them being here.
That territory is very important because it's the land through which so many important right-of-ways come feeding into the city of Montreal. So rail traffic, road traffic, power lines, telephone lines. So you have a lot to do with the geography. Makes it a very unique territory.
When we were trying to go forward and trying to establish the relationships with the different third parties in the community, the council passed a declaration about mutual cooperation, and that sort of opened the door to finding a way in which to deal with sort of those third parties from sort of today into the future. For all too long, it's always been the mantra of those third parties that basically they're here and they don't have to worry about anything. They felt that the Department of Indian Affairs was the people that they had to deal with, and that the Mohawks as a whole were simply there that they had to deal with in a very abstract kind of way. And that really changed when Council pushed forward that declaration and has made them notice that there was more to a relationship from a cooperative standpoint that would benefit both parties at the end of the day. And those third parties are not going away. I mean, they have incredible infrastructure in this community that have cost millions and millions of dollars. They're not about to abandon that. They aren't. It's simple as that. And so, if there's this whole notion of perpetuity in terms of them going to be here forever, then the benefit come back to as well in perpetuity. You can't have it one way and not the other. Right? You either have a relationship and you're in perpetuity, that relationship for forever, if you'll have it, then that's what you need to make sure is found in the fundamental agreements at the end of the day. I'm sure a lot of people from the outside would have liked to have seen us go. Well, that didn't happen, and it ain't going to happen.
Some Kahnawake might have documents passed down from their family in their possession concerning these third parties on the land. What happens from this point?
So many stories out there. There are many, many stories. And those stories are coming from a different perspective no matter who. I mean, don't forget, it has a very much a family perspective. That family may have been directly impacted by something. Well, all those stories are really important, but now you've got to get down to the root of them. Where are those fundamentals of how that story was came to be, and what is the background there, the support to all of those? I mean, we grew up in an oral history, right? And that's our people. Well, we have to go beyond the oral aspect. I know the courts have agreed that oral presentations are admissible in the courts. In my view, I mean, the hard work comes from not only just taking the story at face value, but taking the time to go behind the story and get as much of the information that's documented as possible in order to not only say the story is real, but to prove behind it without a level of any doubt that the proof is there to show that. So that takes work. And that takes a tremendous amount of due diligence and just commitment to finding out every little piece, because I can honestly say the outside is doing it. And if we don't do it, then we're going to be at a disadvantage again. It's already tough enough. I mean, we have, if I can use the analogy of a card game, well, sometimes the cards are really stacked in the other side's deck, and you've got to yank those cards back, and you've got to use any of the tools that you have. From the whole aspect of nationhood and sovereignty to the finite point about my great-grandfather has a document that was signed by someone, and it says right here. Well, and you would say, well, why didn't that come up? Well, we told you. Well, it's one thing to be told, and it's one thing to see it in the story, but it's another thing to have that piece, and that is a critical component to any of these third-party relationships and any of the success of Kahnawake in the future.
What has happened in the decades since the Seaway? Joan, Holmes and Associates undertook a project for the Mohawk Council of Kahnawake to research the facts on several civil engineering projects that crisscrossed the territory in order to articulate historical grievances in the claims processes. The claims proceedings are very long, and in some cases legal opinions have been signed while others are still at negotiations. But Kahnawake have remained adamant on getting lands back, or at least reaching a settlement which would be acceptable by the community.
In the case of Kahnawake, the claims are all very complicated. It's a long history. All of the issues are complicated, and almost all of those claims also overlap with the Seaway claim, because all of the roads, the railways, the hydro lines, they all converge through the village to cross over to Montreal. And that was part of the land that was expropriated for the Seaway.
We also have a specific claim against the federal government for the Seaway itself. Again, there's no beautification, there's no connectivity to the river again, and the clay mountains were just left there after having been dredged out, and that was part of the promise as well, to have it removed.
And those specific claims have been filed and are being worked on sort of as of today, in fact. And that deals with sort of the past issues. And they don't directly impact the third parties.
Those railways and those power lines were the historical work that we did on them was then looked at by Kahnawake and by their lawyers. They did the legal analysis on it and submitted those as specific claims to Canada, stating what their grievances were and how they thought that the issue should be resolved and what the damages should be to the community. So you've got roads, railways, hydro lines, and all of those right-of-ways took land out of Kahnawake, and they make the territory, which was already made smaller by the loss of the seigneury. And then the last really big piece of that was the St. Lawrence Seaway. When the St. Lawrence Seaway Authority decided to build this canal to bypass the rapids, they again used an expropriation process, and they expropriated a lot of Kahnawake land along the waterfront, and they also expropriated land that was already taken out of the territory by roads and railways. And so we have different layers of outside parties that have taken part of Kahnawake land.
The Seaway comes in, entangles that whole web, and then just leaves it on the side. And then at that point you have nothing happening, and you have the Department of Indian Affairs at that point. Whether they were untangling or tangling the web even further becomes a debate from all parties at this point. But nonetheless, that really stepped up the whole situation in regards to the specific claims and then dealing with the third parties as a whole.
There's a political purpose in disrupting the community. There's an economic objective. There's a cultural objective on the part of the government. And for them, it was like a perfect storm. He got to make a lot of money by building the Seaway and setting Canada up to be an industrial power. And then you also got to please the United States, and you got to disable a significant Native community that could potentially be a problem for you down the road. And you got to disrupt them culturally further so that you could move them further into that assimilation. For them, the Seaway was very, very effective. For us, it was a disaster.
Today, our attachment to the river isn't as intimate as it was before the Seaway. We used to get across the water and land using our own energy. Now we're using cars to travel mere short distances. We have adapted to the pace of modern times, but we must never forget that our fundamental understanding of the world is inextricably linked to nature.
That area across the Seaway, the former residential area where people lived, right across from the cultural center, that should be restored to a place almost like a monument, a monumental park. Like, I go down there every time I come home in the summertime, jump in the river and stuff. I mean, I live away, so for me, the first thing I want to do is make a connection when I come back. And so I make a connection by coming visit my friends and stuff, but then the next thing I do is I go jump in the river there. If I think back to what I heard when I was a kid about what it was to be from Kahnawake, it was all about that. If you look at pictures, they're always in the water, they're always near there. Now, it's actually taking back some of its own life. It's coming back. The life is coming back to it, and you can really sense it. So I like that, and the powwow grounds and all that are really different than, I guess, younger people wouldn't recognize it, but really different from 30 years ago or 35 years ago when we used to go play there. and people, it was barren, like someone's porch or something, like a parking lot. That's why I'm kind of focused on that myself as a symbol, because it really is the dirt and the rocks that were dug up from the Seaway covering over what is our natural existence, and it was barren. So culturally we were kind of barren at the same time too. It was kind of wiped out, and then it's coming back to. So I like that as a symbol. Every time I come home, I go around there and I remind myself of where we're at by looking at that.